Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues and listeners, here we are again now, continuing the story of this wonderful book, Turbulence, written by our guest today, David Banmiller, a 50-year veteran of the industry and a man full of wonderful stories and great experiences. The Red Adair of the aviation industry, I'm going to call him.
I don't know about that.
So if I slip up and call you Red, now you know why, David. So
people have called me worse, my friend.
Yeah, haven't we all, eh?
Yeah.
All right, Happy New Year to you, firstly, and what a year.
And the same to you. Who would have ever thought it still boggles the imagination. And I was just looking at some of the stats, they change every day, but 60% of the fleet or whatever the number is now still parked everywhere in the world. 747s gone, a lot of 380s grounded, so many people out of work. It's just, and it's not over. I mean, this next round is even tougher. And I can imagine the people in the industry, particularly, let's call it the planners, the guys that do schedules, because everything follows from the schedule, because the crew scheduling and the maintenance and pricing and competitive activity, it all flows from where are we going to fly, what city pairs, how many times a day, what are the frequencies, what are the equipment types. You go through this unbelievably long checklist, right?
Yep.
What are these guys doing today? They don't even know whether they can go to London tomorrow and who's going to be on the airplane. And then competitors are now starting to say, you might have seen Aer Lingus is moving 4 airplanes to Manchester.
Yep.
Out of here.
Yep.
So that here, Ireland, so that they could fly. And that's going to be a good route because they're going to include Orlando and Boston. So they're setting up sort of a satellite direct in the UK, which I thought was kind of clever.
Yep.
And of course they can do it in part because their brother-in-law, whatever you want to call him, is British Airways, right? Because
exactly,
IAG owns the lot. Good idea.
There's going to be a lot of creativity, and I'm sure all these planners, obviously it's tough on them, but they'll be doing lots of different simulations and practices and what ifs. So part of their risk and their contingency, they'll be looking at all options, because I definitely believe as soon as Q2 hits, everything's going to be a lot more positive, and people are just going to start going crazy. And people's old habits, their old priorities, they're all going to change as well. So
there's going to be pent-up demand for sure.
Yeah. And people will go for longer. They'll go more exclusive, and they'll be happy to spend money. So I think anybody that can hang on in there and focus, for the next quarter, after that it's going to be a good year.
I think it was very clever when British Airways and the planners at Aer Lingus got together, because they can, and decided, well, okay, during these problems, we both shouldn't be flying from London, whether it's Gatwick or Heathrow, to Dublin. So why don't Aer Lingus, you'll do the Dublin runs.
Yep.
Since both of us going, and then we're going to go to other city pairs.
Yep.
And a lot of folks are doing that with alliances, which is not what a lot of people thought might happen, years ago. But today, with the pandemic and scheduling and what priorities, you go where your strengths are. It was just announced that San Francisco to London has no nonstops.
Yep.
Until the middle of March, none, 0. But the fact is, LA has always been a stronger market than San Francisco to London. So what do the planners do? They say, well, okay, people just have to come down from San Francisco and connect, unless LA is going to be our strong point, the West Coast to Heathrow for the next couple of months. That's the kind of stuff going on.
Yeah, but in a way, an awful lot of the pressures and an awful lot of the changes of thinking, it sped everything up by probably a decade in a year. And whether it's automation, whether it's getting rid of a legacy of waste, it's people getting an opportunity now to readdress the business. I just hope that everybody will learn, from some of the experiences and some of the the bad issues that have happened for too long, and all the bureaucracy and politics and egos will start to just move away a little bit. And people need to care about the business that keeps them in their lifestyles. And if that happens, and the employers care about the people and people care about the employers and the business, then it's going to be good. And I know we're going to touch base on an issue to do with strikes and unions as well, because today's chapter is in the cockpit. So we're going to take our listeners back, and it does go back because, David, you've had such a great history of experience, and your memory, thank God, is still so vivid, and you've got some great stories. So what I'd like to start off with now is your first memories of what flying was actually like when you seen a pilot in his uniform. You knew that he was ex-military. There's a sort of an aura around them. There were special people. Just from your very first experience, and then we'll take it to your last experience as to how things had changed in that gap between.
My first flight was when I was in college, senior year, and Villanova was playing Duke, and I think it was Raleigh-Durham. And I flew down, and it was my first flight. I also got sick. It was I think, a Constellation, as I remember. So it wasn't a jet. And that was my first experience. So it wasn't necessarily pleasant, but of course I was in awe, especially back in those days, because people then and still now sit at the end of the runway with their kids and watch airplanes land. And of course, a lot of people did it. So that was my first experience, not significant, but my first. And then that same year, I made president of the Associated Governments of the United States. It's kind of a fancy way of saying I was elected to represent student bodies around the country. So I went out on tour and flew around the country giving speeches for students. This was in the middle of the Vietnam War, so it wasn't necessarily easy. In any case, I did that, and that was my first ride on a 707 Transcon. And that was also an experience I felt terrific to be able to be on that airplane and do that. And then TWA called, and off it went from there. And I think people have always been, and I still am, in awe a bit of pilots. They just don't, the cockpit doesn't get appreciated to the extent of the human factors, the technology, the emotions, the training requirements, the pressure. I could go on and on and on. They're a breed of people that, in some respects, even though I've argued with them a lot, negotiated with them a lot, are some of the heroes of the industry, because, they started by flying mail in the 30s, right? And a lot of them died. And management back then were pilots. Yeah. Today they're marketing and finance and all kinds of things. But back in the day, pilots ran the industries, and the safety record was atrocious. Versus today, it's a phenomenal difference. Yeah. But the pilot challenges now are really more the automation piece. And I don't want to jump around here, but the automation piece, as opposed to then when you had your stick on, your hand on the stick, and you made a couple of maneuvers and everything happened. And today you better know how to fly because the computers are flying. And it is an issue that is on the forefront of the industry these days about the pilots of today are so used to automation. What happens if and when those rudimentary skills are needed in an emergency? It's an interesting topic. But to frame the cockpit, I've been in the cockpit for 5 or 6 airlines. And I'd make 2 observations. The first one is they all talk the same stuff. I mean, I don't like that CEO. We got to change marketing. The pricing crazy. Why do we fly to Chicago? All of these factors, which I may have mentioned before, the funny story where marketing guys in the cockpit and the pilot's going on and on about what they should do in management. And he puts his hand on the throttle, and the captain smacks his hand and says, "You don't know how to fly." And he said, "Yeah, and you don't know marketing." I mean, but and I've loved flying in the cockpit. My first actual real time in the cockpit was when I joined AirCal. I didn't have the authority at TWA, and we were flying from San Francisco to Palm Springs over the San Bernardino Mountains in the twilight. And I said, "Oh my gosh, you don't get to see this view on the sidelines. This is the real thing." And it was wonderful. And I miss it, frankly.
It is an incredible thing, isn't it? And thankfully, I've been in the cockpit many, many, many times, and had an opportunity as well to take off in a Bonanza with an ex-Vietnam veteran who allowed me to do so. And it just puts things into a completely different perspective. And going back, like when I was at school and everything, when people used to talk about an airline captain or a captain, you had this, they were almost like film stars, you know, and it was
much, yeah, absolutely
taking you back to the sort of the Howard Hughes days, you know, when anybody who was a pilot, everybody listened to, they were, you know, they were revered, they were respected, they were, you know, everybody thought that they could, you know, go into a dive and do all maneuvers at the flick of you know, just the thought process. And they were just a different breed. So back in the day, it must have been absolutely incredible to be involved in those early days and see how things changed.
Well, I was involved in the development of the 747 indirectly because I was with TWA and they upgraded me and moved me to New York. And I was like 26 years old, 25, to do value analysis training, which is a way of time and motion studies and improve processes. And that's what they used in part in the development and design of the 747. And Joe Sutter became a very good friend of mine. That was Joe's project. He designed the 7.3 and the 7.4 and just recently passed, but just a wonderful human being. And so I had some exposure to the development of the 747 with the engineers. I mean, I'm not an engineer. I was, you know, it was way above my pay grade at the time, I can assure you, but it was very interesting. And the design of that is incredible in and of itself. But then when you go into the cockpit and you think, if you look at an airplane, you know, I have these models behind me, and that's the Concorde that the captain painted for me. When you look at an airplane and this massive piece of iron, right, and this little piece of real estate in the front with these couple of folks moving some wires around that controls 1 million pounds at 38,000 feet, zipping around the skies. It's, you know, it sort of boggles you. Could you imagine somebody 200 years ago, just for fun, 200 years ago, wakes up like a Rip Van May, wakes up, and he walks onto an airplane, he walks into the cockpit and says, I mean, can you imagine his astonishment?
Yeah, it'll be a little bit like if, please God, we were lucky enough to wake up in another 50 years and see what's going to happen.
Well, I want to be in that hotel that's going around the earth because, you know, it's going to happen.
Yeah. No, definitely.
And on the moon too.
Yeah. Now, talking about how glamorous it was, and lots of things happen like they do in everything. And it's actually less glamorous now than probably ever before. And I know in the book, you know, you're talking about the 737 MAX and about the investigations being just after this was written, etc. So we've got the knowledge now of what that was, but it's not so glamorous now. And do you want to just give us a few of your insights as to why it's not so glamorous? I mean, the obvious one about, you know, the cost of training, and anybody who wants to invest in themselves is phenomenal now. And it's, you know, it's a long burden of debt that any individual who wants to put that amount of investment in oneself is going to have to carry around with them for years afterwards.
Well, yeah, if you sort of dissect the question or the observation and look at it several different ways, I would first go philosophical, which is changes in society. I mean, that seems kind of offbeat, but think about it. Changes in society and the view of authority is certainly different than it was 50 years ago or even 40 years ago. It just is. We can argue about it all day long, but the authority figure for parents, for captains, is different. So we got to put that in its own frame. Second, people that come into the industry used to come from the military. Well, that's not quite the case anymore. And then you got to go and start your own training and get X number of hours, which has gone up a bit in terms of qualifying hours, solo and so on. And that's very expensive. And then you get your first job at maybe $25,000 a year on a small little airplane in the co-pilot seat. And you got to earn your way up over many years to get in the left seat. And then you want another piece of equipment, which pays more, bigger airplane. So then you got to requalify to go into that. So it's a tedious and challenging job, whereas before it was glamorous, and now it's less glamorous. You get less respect societally. And the population that you deal with and the customer base is also different. It just is. And I'm not on some kind of social page right now, but the fact is that people that flew 30 years ago are different than the people that fly today. The masses are flying today. That's good. I mean, that's terrific. I mean, Ryanair brought air travel and Europe to Ireland. They just did. they jammed everybody in, and people could fly for $9.95. And if you took a bag, too bad, sleep 3 days in, in your clothes, and you'll save more money. But it did open up the world. So that's a good thing. But from an attitude towards the cockpit and cabin, but now we're talking about the cockpit, the frame of reference is different. The respect level is different. The attitudes are different. Society is different. So the job is the same job. You take off, you land, and you try to make sure everybody lands alive. And the technology piece has gotten more pronounced, obviously, and you need to be a little bit more proficient from a technical ability than before. You remember in the 30s, pilots flew by the seat of their pants, even before, they had ability to have radar and to have sectors where you flew from sector A to B to C and everything in between. You flew by the railroad. Back in the early days, people say, okay, where's this railroad? Where's this train? And
with flares and everything.
Nobody remembers any of that stuff, but that actually, in case you want to watch some old John Wayne movies like The High and the Mighty, where he had to land that airplane. I think it was filmed in the 40s or 50s. They were the days. So today it's different. I'm not surprised at the image change. I think a lot of it's unjustified. It's a heck of a hard job being a pilot, I got to tell you. And as one who has gone across the table many times with unions, I can tell you that the last second, if you're on an airplane and you have a problem and the captain has to decide what to do, you will give him your house, your American Express card, maybe even your wife. I don't know. But you will give them anything and everything and pray and pay him any amount that he is deserving of to get that airplane down.
Yeah. Yeah. I love, and sorry to interrupt there. I love the last statement that you made in chapter 1. And I'm going to read it because I think it brings everything in perspective. You said, when next walking down the jet bridge, look to your left and into that rather imposing cockpit and imagine that you are sitting in the left seat with 500 passengers. Yes, real people. 1 million plus pounds of metal, aluminium, engines and fuel behind you, guided by a complicated set of instruments that looks like a video game. It is somewhat sobering. So the next time you come face to face with the pilots of your flight, give them a nod of appreciation and respect because they certainly deserve it.
That was very heartfelt, and I meant every single word of it.
Yeah.
And to this day, I do the same thing. And I go into the cockpit. I can't fly there now, but I almost always go into the cockpit, regardless of the airline, and visit with the folks up there. And they are so respectful. They generally say, hey, sit down, what are you all about? And I give them a little Reader's Digest bio CV version, 10 seconds or less. But I started by saying, you see the guys down loading bags? I used to do that. And they invariably say two things. First, gosh, I wish our CEO started as a ticket agent and understood the business. And that's fairly common. I sort of understand it. And the second one is you got to write a book.
Yeah.
Those are two comments I always get.
Yeah. Well, you've done that. And so far, so good. Like the man said when he jumps off a 25-story building, so far, so good. And I'm enjoying every bit of it. So well done you. Now, as far as the glamour side of it changing and the cost, etc., one of the things that's also changed is it was always seen as a man's world. And, and like everything, people are people. Doesn't matter what sex, religion, race, etc. Everybody deserves a chance to do something that might become their love or something that they've had an ambition to do. And in the book as well, it also says that there are approximately, or a full A380 load of female pilots. That's all there is in the industry.
About 3%, the last figure I saw.
Yeah, which is. I mean, something I've noticed a lot more. And when I was with Lufthansa, they were really, really pushing it. I've noticed a lot more, and it's great. But then when you see that number, you think, my God, how small that is.
Well, I think there's a couple of interesting ways of looking at it. First, back into history. When you pulled back the yoke, you had to be strong. I mean, you had to be, it was a man's job because it wasn't automated. You didn't have fly-by-wire.
Yeah.
You were just, and you were pulling back 707, pulling back. That time I had that weight and balance problem out of Chicago, and the guy was pulling back and trying to get up to altitude. So that was the feeling, and subtly about manpower, which of course is academic now. I think the second one is it's gotten so automated that intelligence is the most important part of flying that airplane now. And women are as smart as guys, and sometimes in some aspects smarter. Certainly some of the social stuff and some of the things that they bring to the party are better than men. I mean, we're all made sort of differently. We bring different skills to the party.
Yeah.
And I think in today's world, particularly from a sociology point of view, have enlarged the base of employment for everybody. And women should. You remember Earhart?
Yeah.
That was many, many years ago. You would have thought there'd be a upsurge back then. It took a long time, and the suffragette movement, a lot of other things, I suppose, to get us where we are today. But I think it's very healthy.
Yeah, I got to say, I think it's absolutely superb. And what you're saying there about the move from physical strength to intelligence, with the the autopilot and everything that's happened and changes, and also the fact that pilots don't fly through that much bad weather and storms because they're able to get navigation support and bypass it or fly higher or whatever, or go round it. It's a totally different concept now.
Well, the skill set is different than it was in the early days, obviously. And the ability it's a video game in many respects. I just recently was in the cockpit of both the 380 and the 787. Talk about gee whiz. I mean, it literally, you're in a video game. It's extraordinary stuff. And I think I had a picture in the book of the old 707 and the 787, the cockpits. I mean, they're like different.
Yeah.
And when I was at the Reagan Library a few years ago, I went on Reagan's 707 because it's in the museum, and his helicopter and his limo. And you walked into the cockpit of that 707 and you thought, does this thing really fly? And this was this was Air Force One. And it was so old, and so the dials were, like this digital stuff that didn't exist. It was extraordinary. And it makes you wonder, to play the mind game for the future. What is the future?
Yes. And how much faster it's going to go, because also in this chapter, you talk about, I think it's 1991, when Boeing moved, from an analog conventional cockpit with gauges and dials, which was the 747-300, to a computerized cockpit, which was the 400 series, 8-inch cathode ray tubes, display, all those issues. But the statistic that hit home for me was eliminating some 600 dials and gauges. I mean,
a flight engineer.
That's incredible. And the flight engineer, exactly, yeah. So I think, you mentioned about that, about, when it was deemed safe for a 2-pilot crew and the engineers were dropped. That's, that was I remember that happening as well. That was a big shock to a lot of people.
It was a game changer.
A lot of the engineers went on to be pilots, which was good. But, that was a big change. Amazing. Now, safety and security, obviously, doesn't matter whether you're a modern or a historic pilot. Okay, safety and security, always the most important. And again, another statistic: 11 million to 1 chances of being involved in an air crash, which is like being hit by lightning, which is incredible, or having a cup from the White House. Hey,
that's the seal right here. Yeah,
it makes my poor little my local beach cup here pale into insignificance.
We're all significant, Chris.
Yeah,
just different titles.
I'd like to have a cup from your current commander in chief. I'd love to get one of those.
Well, I have some items from the Trump Hotel in Washington. I'm deciding what to do with them now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I won't ask you what they are.
No, don't bother.
I won't ask what they are. Now, with that safety and security, sometimes things are taken out of your hands, David. And you also mentioned in this chapter about hijackings and bomb threats. And in specific, you're talking about JFK, where you had a real life decisions that had to be made, and also a little bit of a of an exchange with General Curtis.
Yeah, that was one of my interesting events in life, I would say. So it's I'm at LAX, I'm with TWA, and I'm manager of operations. And I had the upstairs and the downstairs kind of, in terms of gate agents, loaders, ops people. And we get a call at 8 o'clock in the morning in LA that says, we just uncovered a bomb in the cockpit of the 747 headed to Los Angeles from JFK. It was the real deal. And there was a note in the satchel. It was a crew kit. So somebody slipped it in as crew kit. And the dogs found it, apparently, for whatever reason they were alerted. There was a note in there that said, go down to Grand Central Station. And they found another note that said the next airplane from LA is going to have a bomb on it. Words to that effect. Now, this was below my pay grade at the time. I was just, part of running an airport in LA. I didn't have exposure to a lot of the super secret stuff that went on behind the scenes. But in any case, we had to make the first decision. What do we do about the 747 sitting at gate 35?
Yep.
3 jetways at that time, by the way, because, we were just beginning this big airplane.
Yep. Yep.
And it was full. And so I went up to the captain, walked to the jetway, walked upstairs, and told the captain that we have a bomb threat, and there was one found in the 7-4 at JFK. So this is real. His first reaction was, let's evacuate right now. I said, you mean the slides? I said, we're at the gate. I mean, we can't do that. I'll never forget his face. So he and I go downstairs, go into the front of the jetway, get on the phone with ops to try to figure out some clarification, right? The clock's ticking in my mind.
Exactly.
And the phone's busy. I'll never forget it. And he's yelling in one ear and I'm getting a busy signal in the other ear. So that's decision-making time. It's that plain and simple. And I very calmly said, here's what we got to do. Let's just take everybody off the airplane. And then we'll push the airplane back, put it in a secure area. The dogs will come out. We'll do and then we'll ultimately match passengers with bags down the road, which was what we were doing at the time.
Yeah.
A long time.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that's what we did. And we cordoned everybody off, had the cops keep everybody in the gate. And then we evaluated all the people. And ultimately we found it secure. And then we left. But they said that a bomb was going to go off every 8 hours. And obviously that was a real threat. So we had guards everywhere.
And they had a ransom. They
were asking a ransom. Yeah. I think out of
$2 million.
Yeah. And it might've been out of Atlanta. I forget where they went, but the feds were involved and security. And so whatever happened on that end, you can imagine, I have no idea. I don't know if anybody was ever arrested or caught for it, but in any case, the alarm bells were going off. So we had guards on airplanes around the United States. Sometime at midnight or around there, a bomb blows up in Las Vegas on the 727, and we had it guarded.
Yeah.
Now that rattled everybody's cages. And the next one was roughly going to be in the morning. And that was all of our big departures are between 8 and 9:30, 10 o'clock out of LA to the East Coast and so on, right? So what do? So I'm out there, and now the camera crews and TV guys are now all over the place. They, you can't keep a secret. I'm being jammed with microphones, and obviously I don't want to say anything. And we decide that we're going to not depart, and we're going to, move people off the airplanes, and we're not going to fly until we decide what to do next. But we're not putting anybody in airplanes and not flying. So this little guy comes up to me. It's at the gate, one of the gates, the rotunda out there at LAX. This little guy with a funny little hat on comes up to me and says, why aren't we going to Washington? I said, well, he said, well, I'm General Curtis LeMay. And I said, Jesus, this is the guy that was involved with the Bay of Pigs, who was head of the Army, Air Force, and whatever. I said, well, General, it's unsafe right now. And he said, oh, you sons of bitches say the same thing. You ought to arm the crews. I'm not making this up. This is exactly the conversation. And I said, you want a shootout on the airplane, 35,000 feet? He said, you all say the same thing. Of course you ought to arm them. And with that, he huffs off. Never saw him again.
Yeah, but I think he would have realized very quickly what he said.
Well, then I had a captain that said, listen, I'm going to Wichita, and I think it's safe. And I said, well, you're the captain. We're just giving you all the advice. But at the end of the day, I guess it's your call. It's not my call because, you're the captain. He takes off and goes to Wichita. Everything was fine. We got everything back together again. I guess they found the guy, but that was a heck of an experience. So when you talk about decision-making and you go to school, graduate school, let's say with your MBA, right? That's not on the subject matter. That's not in the decision-making profile of what you go to school to learn. You either can make those decisions or you can't. And your judgment and experience and background and ability to take pressure and be calm, that's where it's at. That's where, as they colorfully say, where the tire meets the road, right?
Yeah. But it's amazing also from all of those times and what you were saying about, having to make a decision and trying to get through to the control center and it being engaged. That's now why crisis control and emergency response has developed into the models that they have now. It's it's an ever improving, ever increasing learning leadership model that's getting better and better and better.
Well, think about this. When a pilot rotates on takeoff, whatever is going on at that moment in time, I might mention it somewhere in the book, and he's got a warning on an engine, let's say. Yeah. He's got like a second to decide just before rotation. Yeah. Because at some point, you got to take off no matter what. That's what happened with the Concorde that caught fire, when the tire blew up out of Charles de Gaulle. There was not enough runway left, so he had to take off no matter what. Killed a lot of people in a hotel as well as everybody in the airplane. So you make those fast decisions, and you don't have time to say to the co-pilot or others, so what do you think? Let's take a vote. Let's chat about this for a while. Yeah. You got like a couple of seconds to decide life and death decisions. And I don't think the general public has enough appreciation for that challenge when it does happen. And it does happen.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's incredible. Anybody that's responsible for life, other than their own, for a short period of time, or whether it's on a vehicle or whatever, you have to give them an awful lot of respect, because that pressure and stress and mental strength, is so important. And coming back to what you said earlier about the modern day being a systems operator rather than a stick and rudder pilot, and the fact that pilots aren't so many of them now coming from military, so they don't have those extra hours. They don't have those hours that are flying in adverse conditions. They don't have that manual experience. So, it's a big difference when they have to take over the aircraft now, which probably puts them under even more stress and pressure than in the old firm.
Yeah, it does. And from a technology point of view, it's an asset and a crutch, because the asset is not just improvements in the economics of flying an airplane, which are obvious. You get better fuel burn, you route differently, and so on. And we haven't seen the best yet. We've been looking for years of ways to use ILS systems and other literally traffic systems from satellites up in the sky, rather than the arcane systems of going from A to B to C and all those different routes and vectors, which we're still using, which burns an awful lot of fuel. If folks talk about the green folks, and they have legitimate concerns about the environment, but let's put it into use in the right areas. And we should put a lot of money into how we move airplanes around, not running around saying we should have less airplanes. And by the way, why are you flying today? Because you really shouldn't. Well, if you take your car, you're burning more fossil fuels than if you fly as a person on a 300 passenger airplane. But folks don't think that way. And the real effort ought to be, well, from a technology point of view, we know that we can route aircraft around the United States, 10,000 at a time in the air, probably at any moment last year. Anyhow. How do we move them around more efficiently to save fuel? And that can be done. We have not focused on it as we should.
Yeah, 100%. And like even from the smallest, with the taxiing and stands and everything else, it's an art in itself. And with artificial intelligence and telematics and all the good developments that are coming, I agree with you. Things need to be focused on that as well. Also from preventive maintenance, wear and tear, parts, etc. You know, it makes a big difference to everything.
And what the engines of today are so dramatically improved in terms of not just fuel burn and efficiency, but emissions. I mean, remember the old 707s when they took off, you saw the black smoke coming out the back?
Yeah.
Well, that was just a way of life.
Yeah, like a chimney.
You don't see anything now. They're 20, 30, 40% quieter. And the thrust, God, I remember the days when the old 707s, I think each engine had like 10 or 12,000 pounds of thrust. You need 4 of them just to lift, 100,000 pounds or whatever it was at the time, max gross takeoff weight. Whereas now you're lifting 500, 600,000 with 2 engines.
It's
and
amazing.
instead of 12,000 pounds of thrust, it's 125,000 pounds of thrust in one engine.
Yeah.
I mean, it boggles the mind. And they're safer.
Yeah.
And they're more fuel efficient and dramatically less emissions. And the sad thing, Chris, is the industry doesn't get respect for that.
Yeah.
Keep saying, well, oh my God, we're polluting the earth for like, I think 2% in total. They ought to run over to China or India and worry about serious stuff like burning coal in China. But it just doesn't happen that way. And I guess human nature is such that it's easier to attack sometimes the airline industry because people like to do that, but they don't have the facts.
It is, you're right. And it's the facts that count. And also when people hear the word sustainability, they automatically go for one particular hanger to hang their coat. And for me, you know, sustainability is all about planet, people and profit. And all three have got their part to play in the effectiveness of sustainability. And, you know, it's such a difficult balance, but it's one that needs to be communicated better and better PR to make everybody understand more what it means and how you can, you know, get to carbon neutral and carbon underground, all those positive initiatives that are in place will make such a difference. And coming out of this pandemic, more people are going to be focused on that in the future.
Simple things that people don't focus on. You know, we wash the engines. People will think, wow, what do you mean? Yeah, well, you wash the engines because you want to get rid of improve the efficiency and less drag. And airplanes, like anything else, collect dust and dirt and so on. So that's important. People started looking at paint jobs and said, well, wait a second, that's when American went to a lot of aluminum, you know, without paint because of the weight issue. There's an awful lot of science that's gone into the weight component of an airplane, not just the engine performance and all the other factors that you would think about, but there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that the industry does to make sure the airplanes are as light as they possibly can.
Yep. 100%. And we spoke the last time with regards to Pepsi and Coke moving from cans and bottles to the big plastic bottle without degrading their trademark and their bubbles and their experience and everything. Every single ounce counts, which is amazing. Now, Dave, I just want to ask you something. Lots of people have seen the film with Mr. Sullenberger III, Chelsea, and what he did, you know, and, you know, people would think it was a miracle, you know, how did he manage to do it? And all the other stories that were built around it. I mean, that was an incredible thing that was done.
Well, I don't know how many people actually could have done it. You know, I don't know his full bio and background and CV, but, you know, he was a training instructor. I think he might have been in the military before. And he had a great skill set. So not everybody could have done that. He was calm under pressure, a lot of hours in the cockpit. So for him, he approached that with a great background as a captain and flying for, you know, his whole adult life. And that was an extraordinary event. And I think that said good things about the industry and the training component and what these folks are all about, because he very easily could have gone in the wrong direction, gone to one of the airports that the traffic controllers were saying, try to get back to or go over to Newark or one of the private airfields and smaller airports. And he didn't. And that was extraordinary. He became a hero to many people, very justifiably.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And like you said, making those choices and then having the strength of character to do what most others would probably have not done and taken the advice of the air traffic controllers. It was incredible. But the question comes now, even if 10 people could have done that in all the pilots over the last 30 years, I think a question now is how many could do it in the next 20 years because of the fact that they're not actually getting involved in so many flying hours in adverse conditions, and with clouds and storms, and just having the confidence to do something like that?
A lot less. I mean, let's face it. I mean, Sully was flying for his whole adult life, and I'm sure he started out with little small airplanes and really understood aerodynamics. Of course, he also understood that entire area, LaGuardia, yep. Newark, Kennedy, and the skies around it. So he had that going for him, plus an enormous skill set that today they really don't get that same level of experience. So I think it's going to be a challenge. The offset, of course, is improvements in technology. Yeah. Who would have thought birds would bring down 2 engines at the same time, roughly the same time? Birds have always been a problem.
Yeah.
At airports all around the world, and a lot of people go out and they poison and they shoot them and they try to figure out ways, because in some parts of the world, including my time down in Jamaica, in those bogs near water and so on, and certain kinds of birds gravitate towards that. So it's always a constant challenge. You may not know this, Chris, or the listeners probably, but when airplanes are certified, one of the certifications is they take frozen birds and turkeys and stuff and they throw them into the engine.
Yep.
To see, that when they were certifying the largest, GE engines of today that were hanging on the 380s for sure. I think that might be Pratt and Whitney. One of the tests was, throwing all these birds and turkeys in and seeing how the engines perform. Well, the engines are so big these days, they probably just eat them right up. But yeah, that's a component, and it's always been around in the industry.
It's amazing, isn't it? Now, just a hypothetical question. How do you think Sully would have responded with the 737 MAX issues for the two fateful examples that, are all too recent?
I don't think it would have happened. And I say that without any specific knowledge. It's just sort of a gut reaction, because I said to myself, would that happen with an American Airlines or people that are well trained? Because in certain parts of the world, it's harder to get qualified, trained, experienced pilots. And there's a lot of expats, that fly Saudi Arabia and Etihad and my old place down there in Burma.
Yeah.
We contract pilots. So they get part of that, but the skill set is obviously different, and the training is not, in my opinion, as robust as with an American Airlines. Now, Americans had incidents. Every airline has had some incidents, pilot error, lots of them have happened. But in this particular case, it's a good question. My sense of things is they might have figured it out differently, and they might have reacted differently to what they were being told, in terms of the airspeed and inclination of the nose and the angle and how they would respond. You only had a couple of seconds in any case, but I suspect that might not have happened with Sully.
Yeah, because you think he would have picked up about the low airspeed and not the correct. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, it's a. I mean, it's not.
Look, you don't have a lot of time.
No. Good God, no. Now, back in '81, when you were with AirCal, there was a 737-200 crashed on landing at John Wayne. You mentioned John Wayne Airport earlier, or when you mentioned John Wayne earlier, but at John Wayne Airport, where there was a problem, one taking off, one landing.
What happened was, I think it was actually a Friday afternoon around 5 o'clock, as I remember, but a guy comes in, Captain, never forget his name. His wife also worked for us. And he's coming in outside John Wayne, and there's an airplane in front of him getting ready to take off. And the tower, I think it was probably around 2,000 feet, but the tower said, because landing gear comes down at around 2,000 feet, but you need to go around because I don't think he's going to take off in time. And Captain made a judgment, split-second judgment. He looked, because you could see it, the visibility was fine, that he thinks he would be okay. And as he got closer, he realized, whoops. Well, see, by that time, he was too low. He pulls up, right? Well, he stalls because the airflow over the wings changes, and he stalls. So he drops like a rock at the end of the runway. Now, the fire station is in the middle of the runway on the right.
Yeah, yeah.
And those guys are always ready and alert. They saw the airplane coming because it stopped right in front of them. So it hits, both engines fall off. It skids off to the right and it stops, and it didn't explode right away. So they evacuate, the fire department's on site right away, you know, at the airport. I was in charge of the emergency protocols at the time. Every airline has protocols, and you push a button and everybody goes to a certain place. They open the books, they're assigned a certain seat. It's very, very specific, and you rehearse it every 6 months, including with your co-chair partners as well. So I was at the desk right away. I happened to be in the building. So we formed the committee, literally 5 minutes, and we hooked up with the airplane and the station people on radios, because it was right around the corner from our headquarters, like 2 miles. So I was on the radio with the people at the crash site, evacuating the airplane. Everybody got evacuated. We were ordering the buses, and I was giving instructions to make sure you watch where the people go, and those that go to the hospital, I want people at the hospital. And I was saying such things as be nice to people because lawsuits are down the road and the press will pick up and all. I didn't know that it was all going out live in Southern California. Every station was tapped into that radio frequency.
Oh.
So the VP of PR comes running upstairs and says, Dave, every word you're saying is on channel 2, channel 5, radio, television in Southern California. Well, that was a wake-up call, wasn't it? So in the middle of all of that, they're off the airplane, and a couple of firefighters go up and they walk on the wing and they get ready to go in the exit over the wing. Just as they're going in, the airplane blows up. Now we hear it over the, I said, what's that? And they said, well, these 2 guys just jumped out in time and the airplane just exploded.
2 lucky fellas, huh?
Whoa. So nobody was killed. Some people were hurt. You know, when you jump down slides, somebody's going to twist an ankle or something. So, and that airplane sat there for months. We kept bugging the NTSB, can you cover up? Can we take it away? Because when you're flying at Newport Beach, you got the AirCal airplane, and you know, in
not a good thing to be dealing with. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember going out at 3 o'clock in the morning after we kind of calmed down in the emergency center. And I went out to the airplane with our maintenance guy, and I walked onto the airplane. And I just imagined if people had been in those seats, because it was all charred and burned, and quite a wake-up call, I have to tell you. And at the end of the day, that was a mistake. Now, I have occasionally been on airplanes where we had go-arounds. I'm sure you have too. It's not uncommon.
Yeah.
And I've had it coming into Paris years ago at the last second. And I had it when I was at Aloha a couple of times, but one, I was in the cockpit and we were coming into Honolulu, and we saw right in front of us, turned right for the runway, and Pearl Harbor's right in front of us. You make the right turn and you're coming in, and you're not supposed to talk below 10,000 feet, although you kind of tend to. We shouldn't, but nobody said a thing. And we're all watching the airplane in front of us. And the captain's got his hand just ready to go around, and we're all quiet, the pilot, co-pilot, and me. As he comes in, it may have been 1,000 feet or something like that, or maybe less. And the tower says, go around, bam. We were just all ready, and we went around. Very common stuff. Well, Captain Clark didn't.
Yeah. But right. So now when you say he didn't as instructed, or he decided to overrule the instruction?
Well, at the end of the day, the captain makes the final decision. So the air traffic controller is a provider of information, but isn't the final authority. Yeah. I mean, he could say go around, and they should, and he could say rise to 10,000 feet. I mean, who's going to say, I think I'll stay at 8,000 instead of 10. So the guy does have a lot of authority, but at the end of the day, in critical situations, the pilot in command is the pilot in command. And he made that judgment call. It simply was the wrong one.
So then there would have been a hearing, and that's where ALPA would have been involved as well, representing the crew.
They were, and I fired them.
And because of making that wrong decision.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm not proud of it. I was one of the hearing officers, and I've had a number of those unfortunate situations. I mean, pilots are human. They make mistakes like anybody else. God knows I've made a bunch of mistakes. I mean, I don't want to criticize somebody else because I certainly am capable of human error and have proven it more times than I like to talk about. But at the end of the day, when you're running the place, you've got to assume responsibility, and people watch what you do, not what you say as much as what you do. And okay, what are you going to do now, Dave? So you have the hearing. I mean, he deserves a voice, and you take all the information in, and then you make a decision. It was a tough deal.
Yeah, no, very. The reason I asked that is because there was another incident where you were involved with two crew and a stewardess, and they both had too much to drink on a night stop. Now, one of the things we were talking about earlier about the perception of pilots, and they have a lot of downtime, sleep deprivation. The amount of stopovers aren't as long as they used to be, and they're under pressure. They're on their own a lot. Now, obviously, drink and drugs must be an issue as well, because it is in all areas of society. So when something like that happens, in the case that you mentioned in the book, you decided to support the stewardess to give us some rehabilitation.
We put it through rehab. Yeah, we put
rehab. Yeah.
But
the crew were dismissed.
Well, here's the way the scenario worked. She was the person involved with the two pilots, and they drank until 1 or 2 in the morning in the Hilton in Oakland, and then went up to one of the rooms and had some more alcohol. So the three of them were well beyond the 8-hour bottle to the throttle environment. And we found out about it because the gate agent in Oakland alerted us in advance. And the supervisor met the airplane, and the crew had her in the cockpit the entire trip, which in and of itself was a mistake. But beyond that, she's supposed to be in the cabin when you're having emergency evacuations. It's 1 flight attendant for every 50 passengers. In any case, so we had a hearing. And in her case, she was clearly an alcoholic, been with us a long time. So we put her through rehab. That was not my decision. I wasn't the president at the time, but obviously I was involved. And when it got to the pilots, we had a hearing, and I conducted the hearing. And ALPA represented the pilots, which is appropriate. I mean, they deserve a voice, like in any court environment. So they defended the pilots, and I had hired a detective to go up and talk to the bartender and get receipts. And one of the pilots put the charge on his American Express card with the time and date and how much they consumed, which one would argue was not a really smart thing to do. But in any case, so I had that in my file as I was talking to the unions, the APA guys. And I said, look, I know you have to defend, and I get it. And I'm really sad and disappointed in the whole affair. But here are the facts, and we can't ignore the facts. We have to take responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And I'm reluctant to talk about some of the stuff on one hand because I feel disappointed and sad, and I don't want to have people misunderstand pilots and their qualifications and their performance and so on and so forth, because it's so untrue. But occasionally, as we see today, guys are stopped going through security. All of alcohol. I mean, it happens. So as a responsible executive, you can't ignore it.
Yep.
Yeah, you just can't. And then when the facts are so overwhelming, you have to take action, which we did. And I don't know that they even appealed it. So we had to do that. And it was unfortunate, but that's such a small percentage. And occasionally you have to look, executives are the same way. I had to get rid of a CFO once that showed up in a couple of meetings with investors and investment bankers, totally blasted. I mean, beyond control. And he was our CFO, and I fired him the next day because some of those things you just
you don't get a second chance at a first impression. And
everybody watches what is Dave going to do? What's he going to say?
No, it's incredible, isn't it? Something I wanted to ask you now. in all the hotels that you contract for your cruise, did you have like within the SLA or within the contract terms, a sort of like a duty of care, a just culture whereby the hotel would have to report if they felt that any of the crews were entering into a higher level of alcohol than would be recommended or allowed?
No, we never had that. Maybe some airlines do these days, I don't know. But I would be surprised, hotels, like in any other industry or hospitality sector, they're exposed to a lot. And crew member staying overnight is a very valuable resource because it's guaranteed revenue 365, So yeah, from their perspective, they'd like to just kind of say, that's not within our.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? It's a tough one, yeah. Commercial.
And they don't necessarily know when the guys are going to fly and what it's all about. But it was unfortunate. But as I said, and I would underscore again, it's such a small percentage, and it happens from time to time everywhere, whether you're an executive or a pilot or a loader or a lawyer. Or look at the investment bankers and the crazy guys, the Wolf of Wall Street. I mean, that's real stuff.
Yeah.
These guys, between drugs, cocaine, the booze, and all that, was symbolic of a lot of what went on. Certainly back in the day, not as much now, but certainly I can assure you, I lived alive and in person in the 60s and 70s in New York City. I watched, marketing people and some of what went on. The Mad Men series is pretty accurate, I got to tell you.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. The reason I asked that is because years and years ago, I was with Lufthansa, and we went for a lunch break, which was okay, And we went for a lunch break. We went into a little place near Heathrow Airport called Staines, and we were in a pub, and we all had a pint of beer, maybe 2 pints, whatever was legal for driving then. And as we were going, one of the guys picked up his uniform cap. And we were ground staff, so you had a similar type of uniform, the peak caps with the stripes, and Lufthansa was all into that. And he said, thanks very much. He said, got to go. He said, we've got to get a flight off. And somebody in the bar called, and this is before mobiles, they called the management at Lufthansa and said, some of your pilots are in a pub in Staines. And fair play to them. They were justly concerned. But by the time we got back, we were called into a room and we were given a warning that, if you're going to go to lunch and if you're going to have any liquid whatsoever, whether it's within the limits or not, you do not do so wearing a uniform. And that would have been back in the late 70s, early 80s.
I think it's still that way today, Chris. I don't think you're going to find many pilots in bars in uniform.
Yeah, no. We weren't pilots, Dave. We were just ground crew.
Oh, yeah.
And the public they mistook us for pilots because of the stripes on the uniform. Lufthansa had a lovely. I think, to be honest with you, a lot of the young lads, they joined Lufthansa so they could wear the uniforms.
Would that be the German militaristic kind of?
It was beautiful, dark blue. It was a cracking.
Only at Lufthansa, only in Germany, I guess.
Yeah, no, it was good. Now, something else that I know you're very proud of is with the increase in air traffic, you were worried about near misses, and you actually got a videographer to come and have a look and really do real-time taping, and then you presented it to Washington.
Yeah, what happened was I was getting a lot of calls because pilots would call me direct at home in Newport Beach when I was with AirCal, and complained like I just had a near miss. I mean, literally 10 o'clock at night, I remember the call. And I'm one of those guys that wants to champion the cause of employees, especially when they're clearly right. I mean, it's part of your job as an executive to support your people. And if they do something wrong, you take action. If they do something right, you take action. And if they're at risk, it's your responsibility as an executive to do something about it. I did the same thing at Air Jamaica with, the British throwing all these detainees and criminals on airplanes in Jamaica to get, deportees. And some of them were just nutcases. And anyhow, but back to this situation, I decided to put a videographer who happened to also be a flight attendant in the cockpit filming coming into Orange County. And it was alarming because you're coming in at 3,000, 2,000, ATC would say, bogey at 3 o'clock, altitude unknown, bogey at 6 o'clock, altitude unknown. You're here in Southern California, airspace is like crazy. You know, you got 4 or 5 airports. And back in the day, there was a mid-air over Cerritos, I think with the Air West at the time, which got everybody sensitive. So it was a problem. So I said, okay, so what do we do about it? So I was getting pretty close to Norm Mineta, who ended up as Secretary of Transportation under Bush, who put down the airplanes in 9/11. But Norm at the time was chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee in Congress, pretty important position. And he's from San Jose. And Norm was the guy that got us rights from Vancouver into San Jose, bilateral rights with Canadians. So we got along pretty well. And he knew General Lyon, the owner of Air Cal, very well. So I went to see Norm, and he invited another congressman from our area to have lunch. And I had a private room, and they flicked on the video. In other words, it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to say, okay, guys, you're in the cockpit.
Yeah.
I put him in the cockpit visually. That's what I did. And they couldn't believe it. And I said, is this really going on? I said, yeah. And guess what? A lot of these people don't have transponders. Transponder lets air traffic control. Your little blip here. And then if they say squawk, you click your transponder and it squawks and they know where you are.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't mandatory on a lot of airplanes. So I really pushed hard. This was even before the collision avoidance systems that are in the cockpits today, which is another safety. Talk about technology improvements. It warns people, go left, go right, go up, go down. Somebody's in front of you. And they took action. They brought out a cocktail napkin and wrote down, I think they even gave it an HR number. They assign HR numbers, you know, to when you do legislation. And they gave it some number and pushed it through legislation. And so we made improvements. We didn't get everything I wanted because there's a lot of lobbyists against it, particularly the Private Pilots Association. And those very, very powerful, kind of like the NRA. They're very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And they resisted it because of the cost, which, by the way, wasn't that much money for put a transponder in an airplane. But that's the story. And I think it serves as an example of the kinds of things that you should do in support of your industry, your company, employees, and you got to listen.
Yeah, no, you have to. You got to be brave enough to say the right thing at the right time for the right reason, even though it might get the wrong response.
Well, and the FAA really should have been at the forefront. And I don't recall who was running the FAA at the time. I think it was an admiral, actually. But in any case, the political appointments of people to run the FAA is always a challenge to me personally, because that is a very important job. It's one thing to make a Secretary of Education, not that that's not important. When you start talking about Secretary of Transportation, you're talking about lives, real lives at risk. And then they appoint the head of the FAA, who gets approved by the Senate, which is the way it ought to be. But do they have the qualifications, or is it all political? These days, it's mostly political.
Yes,
it needs to be qualification based.
Yeah, far too political. And in some cases, they're the minister that nobody knows what to do with them, so they put them in charge of transport, either transport or education. Yeah.
And unfortunately, in the transportation sector, it's not just air, you know, it's ground, it's trucks, it's trains. You know, the Elizabeth Dole was Secretary of Transportation. You know, her husband was Senator Dole, who I had the pleasure of having breakfast with when I was in Newport Beach. Really a nice human being. And I also knew Elizabeth very casually. She's the one that required taillights to have one above the, you know, the in the back window. Not just below, but in the window. That was Elizabeth Warren when she was Secretary of Transportation, pushed that through. And I'm sure she saved lives because of it.
Good on her. Good on her.
Seatbelts. I mean, the DOT ended up carrying the flag for seatbelts. And how many lives have been saved because of that, I wonder.
Yeah, no, true enough. Now, at the beginning, we were talking about what it is to be a pilot and whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And it's now not as glamorous as it was. But nonetheless, after 9/11 and a few other incidents, it wasn't the best of jobs to be having, because they were losing jobs. So now, after this pandemic as well, and the amount of pilots that have been laid off, people were talking hugely about, a pilot shortage.
Yeah.
This time last year and towards the end of 2019. And now they're talking about how long it's going to take for it to come back, and also the amount of experience that's leaving and the new generation of pilots. It's going to be a tough period for them, huh?
There's no question. I'll offer sort of a scenario to 9/11, and that was, I met the first airplane back in Minneapolis when I was with Sun Country, and they really took it hard. I mean, the emotion in the cockpit and cabin on that flight, it's hard to explain. But the captain quit because he couldn't take it.
Yeah.
And I met with him, and I offered psychological support and assistance. He said, I'm never going to fly again. And he never did. I think in this particular situation, when it's all said and done, a lot of folks that are kind of, let's say in their 60s, they'll take early retirement. They're not going to come back.
Yeah.
I don't see it. They're going to change their lifestyles and so on. So there's where we're facing a shortage. Then all of a sudden we said, well, wow, we got a lot of pilots this year floating around without work. But that's going to change because of the nature of things, and a lot aren't going to come back. And then you got a huge training requirement.
Yeah.
It's not like jumping in a cab and taking your next passenger. It's so much more complex.
Yeah.
All these folks have to go through training. I think some of the airlines are probably rotating crews around. So they're not flying 60, 70 hours a month, maybe 10. I don't know this is a fact, but that's what I would do. I would rotate the airplanes to keep them flying. One sits for a week and then flies. And the same with the crew members to keep them as current as possible.
Exactly. Yeah, so important. Well, David, we're almost at the end of chapter 1. And one of the things that we should probably touch base on is what's coming. So the autonomous air traffic, and whether you want to call it the urban air mobility program, or, we're talking about air taxis, or whatever you want to say. So whether it's from Amazon to UPS, or what's the one, Volocopter, or Volocopter, the German company that's been working on it for a long time. So, from 2 people to 4 people, how long really do you think it's going to be before we see that in cities, whether it's in Singapore or wherever they're going to, do a trial?
Well, I think it's around the corner. I think if we look at a time perspective, 50 years from today, it's going to be what you used to watch in movies, and cartoons and stuff. That's going to happen. People are going to have their airplane outside, and you're going to lift off because it'll go straight up, and then off you go. I mean, we already have drones all over the place. In fact, they're being regulated now because they need to be.
Yeah.
So, and Amazon is already starting to fly packages around. So the next step is obviously people, and whether they have flying qualifications or not, they could do the whole thing automatically. So it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, especially because of the problems that they're going to face for the next few years. But it's going to happen. And the regulatory control of that activity is going to be very important, because you can't just let it happen.
Yep.
So all the regulatory agencies around the world, I'm sure, are thinking about it, and will be in the process of regulating and rule structure and training structure and approval levels. I would hope will happen. But technology-wise, it's a matter of time.
Yeah. And it's incredible, isn't it? Like, I was talking with somebody. They've got drones now that could actually be sent into battle, and could take out injured soldiers, 1 or 2 at a time. Yeah. And when you think of that, you think, my God, that's incredible. And then when you think with a dark hat on, and you think about cybersecurity and modern terrorism, people getting access to those controls, it opens up a terrible, alternative development.
Yeah, in some respects, it's an unsafe world, Chris, and I'm afraid that's been around for centuries.
Yeah.
We're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah. So again, now just finishing where I commented about that last article you had, it comes back to a lot of respect for people who've got a huge amount of accountability and responsibility. And so the next time you come face to face with the pilots on your flight, give them a nod of appreciation and respect, because they certainly deserve it.
I agree so wholeheartedly with that, Chris. Absolutely.
Yep. It was well written, well put. And for everybody, we go on to the second chapter, which will be, we're moving from the cockpit to the cabin. So more stories, more memories, more insights, more guidance. David, as always, thanks very, very much indeed.
Thank you.